Welcome to this session. My name is Stefan Tilkov. I'm going to talk about REST. I've said that a few times. So I gathered up some stuff that I found occurs again and again in discussions about REST. My plan for this session is to start off with a pretty brief introduction, but I'll only do that if some of you think it's worth your time. So how many of you have actually been doing REST in practice, building some systems and stuff like that? Okay. Who hasn't ever done anything with REST and has only the faintest idea what it might be about? Okay. So, yeah. So who considers themselves an expert? Oh, that's a funny question. Yeah. Not even Ian raises his hand, which is weird. Okay. So we're going to talk about REST. Let's start with his intro and get it over with pretty quickly. So this is what REST is. It's all actually pretty easy. It's a number of things. Oh, sorry, messed up my animation here. So what you can see up top, that's essentially the definition of REST. It's all very easy. It's a number of constraints and architectural style. That's all. Thanks. Have a nice day. So obviously, in this dissertation, this PhD thesis, there's a lot of stuff. There are a lot of definitions. There are a lot of things that cross-reference each other. And actually, there is nowhere in this dissertation can you find a single sentence that says this is what REST actually is, right? I think it's a pretty good paper. It's a pretty good document, and it has excellent value, and it has the great benefit of being the one answer, giving the one answer on any question you might have. Everything that Roy Fielding, the inventor of REST, has answered in this paper is an authoritative answer. There's no arguing with that. Unfortunately, he doesn't answer everything, or at least he doesn't answer it in an easy to access way. And many people keep wondering whether REST is as ill-defined as other things that we're dealing with. For example, SOA, or components, or object orientation, or microservices. And it's not. Actually, REST is pretty well defined because it has this definition, because it has a set of architectural constraints. So what that means is that you define a set of rules, and if something adheres to those rules, then it can claim to be an instance of this particular architectural style, right? So an architectural style is to an architecture as a design pattern is to an implementation, right? It's a bit more abstract. It captures certain things about how you might want to approach something, and if you follow these particular rules, then you can claim to have built an instance of this. You don't have to do that, and there are, as Roy would be the first one to point out, disadvantages to some of those things. For example, stateless communication means that you don't gather up session state on the server side, so that has a cost. It means you have to either make stuff explicit on the server side as something stored there, or transfer it with each request. Right? You have choices to make, and that's what all this is about. So to give you some sort of introduction here, to give you some sort of identification, I picked one sentence from Roy's PhD thesis, which talks about a number of things. So the first thing it talks about is identification of resources. Identification of resources is something that we see on the web all the time. Right? It's what we're using all the time. Every time we see a bus going by on the street that has a URI, has a URL on its side, we use this concept because we can take that URL and put it into our browser's address bar, hit enter, and get back a page that tells us something, right? So identification of resources on the web means use a URI for everything that you think is worth it, right? Everything that you think has value should have its own URI so that you can reference it, so that you can access it directly. One of the great values of this REST idea is that we all agree on a way to identify stuff, right? So we make this kind of identity concept universal. It doesn't matter whether it's my application or your application or Josh's or Ian's, whoever has built that stuff, if they all use the same concept, if they all use URIs, then we have a unified idea of how to identify things, which means they become targets for links, right? We can link to them. If they don't have a URI, we can't do that. They become something that you can bookmark so that you can go back to it later. They become entry points to your application. If your application has a single URI, it has a single entry point. In fact, that's the case with many web applications that are built in big companies. many of the applications I deal with are built this way. And that's sad. It offers this concept, or it sacrifices the idea of identifiability to some weird idea of programmer happiness. And I don't really understand why people who program JSF talk about programmer happiness, but some of those applications built this way lack this simple concept of giving everything that's important its own URI. So the first thing is just that. Note also that I'm not talking about web services here, right? I'm talking about anything that's on the web. It doesn't matter whether it's something that you might call a web service, something that offers you JSON over HTTP for some programmatic interchange, or something that is a UI application that gives you some HTML. It doesn't matter. In fact, this distinction was never important to somebody like Roy, or to the people who actually came up with these whole ideas. It's all just the same thing. Now, once we have those things, those identifiable things, we have to somehow interact with them. And the way to interact with them is by means of representations. So they can become represented in some data format. And that actually gives us some aspects that we're all familiar with as well. There is a certain amount of metadata. We know something about the stuff that we exchange with a server. There's something like a content type, and there's an accept header allowing us to do content negotiation. We have in fact, a separation of concerns of certain things. We have a separation of concerns of the actual data that we send, the identity that this data has, and the location where it's at. So these are all separated parts. Identity is something that's far more constant in your application's lifecycle or in your system's lifecycle than the actual data that's being exchanged. If you think about that for a while, if you come up with all the things that are worth being identified in your system, like, for example, your customers and your orders and the steps in approving something, or whatever it is that you find of being worth of having its own URI, those identities are very, very stable. The data might change, the format might change, but what has an identity today will probably have an identity next year as well. So if we separate those things, if we introduce a separation of concerns, we can actually have multiple representations at the same time. So we have the same thing represented in various different ways at the same time, or different representations over the course of time. So these might actually be, if you want to call them that, versions, although we'll get to that in a moment. So if a customer gets 5 new attributes, that's perfectly fine. They get 5 new attributes, but it's still the same customer, right? It's still the same entity, the same identity that was there before. Using this concept, we reduce dependency on implementation details. We have this URI, this thing that identifies something. It doesn't matter in which system it resides. It doesn't matter whether you move it somewhere. As long as you have a URI to it, you can connect to it. Connecting to something by means of its URI is probably the most loosely, is that a word? The least coupled way to access, to connect to something, right? You connect to something if you only know its URI by means of the assumption that it's going to have something that'll serve data over HTTP, right? It's a very weak assumption. Resource manipulations representations also enables a processing model. It's typically connected to the type of data that you exchange. For example, if you use HTML as a data format, then there is a certain processing model connected to that, the one you're all familiar with, right? Forms and links, and you submit something, you get back something, you get a redirect, whatever it is. That's actually HTTP. The format itself defines the way the representations that are sent back and forth between client and server, which is a general principle that you can, as you can with many things, see embodied in HTML, but can and should also strive for in your own designs. So second thing, we have those things and they have representations. The third one is that we have Hypermedia as the engine of application state. I won't make an acronym of that because it's stupid. So Hypermedia as the engine of application state essentially means that once you have all of those things, you link them together in a meaningful fashion, right? They're connected in some way, and those connections between things are something that you want to surface in your API or in your system, in the surface of your service design, right? So the primary thing that people talk about when they talk about connecting Hypermedia is links, right? Many people talk about links. By the way, there are seats left in the front if you don't want to stand in the back. So links is the first thing, but there are not only links, there are also forms. so that you can actually build up a new request based on data coming to you from the server. We'll get to that as well. There is a certain flow idea here, right? So we have Hypermedia as the engine of application state, with the sense that you actually navigate through an application by means of the responses that you get from the server. You don't have a predetermined path that you have hard-coded in your client that goes from one step to the next. You have something that is done based on the amount of information that you get, or the kind of information that you get from the server. Actually, I'm repeating myself, but if you look at HTML in the browser, that's a great example of a RESTful system. Now, somebody will complain, but the browser doesn't do put and delete, screw it, I don't care. In terms of HTML and Hypermedia and the responses and the kind of the low amount of hard-coded assumptions in the browser is an excellent example of a very great RESTful client. Finally, we get to decide where to put status, right? We can put state in the responses and have it sent back to us in the next request, or we can put the state on the server, have it addressed by a URI. These are all aspects of the decisions that I make when I design my Hypermedia system. So 3 things. We have identified things, we give them a URI. We exchange representations, so we separate identity and the actual data that represents what's identified by this thing. And then we use Hypermedia as the thing to control our flow. Finally, we have self-descriptive messages. And self-descriptive messages essentially just means that you should be able to make sense of something if you look at the actual message. Right? So this is sort of a manifest against metadata. I shouldn't have a documentation to read to make lots of assumptions unless that documentation is standardized and part of an RFC. That's fine. I'm not supposed to take a look at a message for which I do not know the protocol or the format and then magically in some sort of AI way make sense of that. That's not what this is talking about. Rather, we're talking about using standardized formats wherever possible, using well-defined formats where I can actually from the message conclude where I can find more information about what's happening, right? So again, we have the metadata aspect within the message, right? So the message itself, for example, might contain a content type. There's a header called content type that says this is the identifier for this content type, so that I can go to the IANA and look up in the content type registry which RFC defines that thing and then find out what it actually means that I'm looking at, right? So there's a standardized way of addressing that. So standardization plays a very important role here. Another aspect is that you get from this is provider independence, right? I'm not accessing something that is specific to this particular instance of a service or to this particular machine I'm talking to. I'm not using Amazon's HTML. If I talk to Amazon to buy a book, I'm using the same HTML that I'm using when I talk to Google, right? It's the same format. It's the same thing. Ideally, at least, formats are independent of particular entities that actually use them, right? This whole idea of having all of this standardized information, all of these headers, enables us to produce very, very useful intermediaries. So we can put a machine between a client and a server without knowing which client and which server that's going to be, right? There's a box there that will just take a look at the messages and do something useful with them. My favorite example is always the caching intermediary, something like a reverse proxy cache. That'll sit somewhere and look at the messages, and based on the metadata that tells you something about the freshness requirements, will intelligently put this information in memory and serve it to you from there. Right? This is all something that you can only do because the message itself is so descriptive. In fact, if you come from an SOA background, and many people have done SOA before they discovered REST, which is sort of tragic because it was originally the other way around. So many people who have discovered REST after SOA find a similarity here between the vision that was in this web services world in terms of SOAP headers, right? But that's not a coincidence. It is exactly the same thing. In fact, one of the people who wrote the SOAP spec was earlier a member of the HTTP working group and helped write the HTTP spec. Right? So of course you can see similarities here. But in contrast to the web services world, this one actually took off in a big way. So we have this theoretical definition. We have a PhD thesis. We have lots of talk about architectural styles. And many people freely admit that they have never actually managed to read the thesis. But I can tell you it's actually not that hard. I'm not a good thesis reader, not at all. But I could manage, so probably you can as well. So who here has read the thesis? That's impressive. That's about 5. That's a better number than I usually get. So maybe you should do that on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Phrased differently, if we really boil it down, if we really try to distill the essence of all of this, then it's nothing more than what we see in the web, right? We have this web thing that we're working with all day. And the web is exactly that. It's lots of things with URIs or URLs, if you prefer, right? Lots of things that have a URL, and they're all connected by means of Hypermedia. So you can link to something directly, you can post to something, you can share something on Twitter or whatever it is they do on Facebook. So you can do that, and it's governed by standard formats, right? So that your generic client can actually understand that. Still, today, that's the case. We can hope it'll stay so for a while. And we're not all going to be using whatever Facebook's successor to HTML is going to be called. So this is sort of the groundwork, right? We have this idea. It's very important to notice this is not something just for web services. This is not the thing that is supposed to replace SOAP, right? It's a completely different level that we're talking about here. We're talking about this abstract architectural thing that has certain constraints and that actually governs, actually tells you when you can claim that something is RESTful or not. Now, I've been doing this for a while, and despite my efforts, it has actually become more widespread. Sorry. So it has actually been quite successful, this whole REST thing, because people noticed that there is a lot of value, especially opposed to alternatives that are out there. But there are some common misconceptions, some things that people think. And I've listed a few. I would love to get more from you, assumptions or misconceptions or things that you strongly believe where I'm wrong or where you have seen others call something REST that you think is not. And I'd love some discussion on that. So let me get quickly through this and we can see how many of those you have run into and how many of those you agree or disagree with. Right. So this one is probably my favorite one. Right. So REST is about pretty URIs, right? We have a nice RESTful URL or a nice RESTful URI. And that's just totally, it's totally broken. This whole concept is totally broken. So let's take a look at why that is the case. I present you some URIs, right? Let's take a look at this one. Who would say that's a RESTful URI? Who thinks this is RESTful? Okay, let me phrase it differently. Who thinks it's not RESTful? That's a significant number. Okay, why not? Any idea why not? The format? Why is format a problem in that URI? Sounds instructive? Destructive. Oh, okay, destructive. Any other thing?
It seems to be mixing different entities.
It's mixing different entities back there? It has a query parameter, okay?
If you read the URL, it looks like a command.
It looks like a command, okay? Anything else? Good. Sorry? No identification, okay. What about this one? Is this a RESTful URI? Who thinks this is a RESTful URI? 4 or 5. Who thinks it's not? That's a few more. So why do you think it's not a RESTful URI? It has get details. It sounds like a verb, right? Anything else? Query parameter, somebody said, right? So that will apply as well. Anything else? The customer doesn't have a unique ID or URI for customer? Okay. Okay. So the customer can actually be identified. Good. What about this one? Who thinks this is not RESTful? Why not? It contains a verb again, okay? Anything else? Sorry?
It's repeating what you should actually do with the HTTP verbs.
It's repeating what we should do with HTTP verbs. How so?
There's the delete.
There's a delete in there. Anybody else? Any other comment on that? What if I use a delete to invoke that? Is it then RESTful or not?
Deletes the delete command.
Deletes the delete command. Okay. Okay. What about this one? Who thinks this is a RESTful URI? Who thinks it's not? Who abstains? Okay. Final one. What about this one? Is it RESTful? Some people think. Why is it RESTful? It has an ID? Okay. Who thinks it's not RESTful? Why not? Sorry? I didn't catch that, I'm sorry. It's got a verb in it again, okay. So what if this returns an edit form? Is it then RESTful? People, you are crazy. I don't know why this happens all the time. Now, think about what we just did. I showed this slide. This slide, right? To everyone in this room. I showed it to everyone. I made a point of saying there is no such thing as a RESTful URI. And the very next second, I put up this slide, right? And nobody except Ian, well, that's probably not true. Some people never raised their hands, and I just assumed they didn't want to spoil my stupid joke, right? So essentially, you can make no assumption whatsoever from the letters, from the characters that make up a URI. You have no idea what these things do. I didn't even tell you what verb I use, right? So maybe if I do a delete on this URI number 3, that's exactly what I want. It's a particular URI that I expose from the server so that somebody can do a delete on that. Why would that not be RESTful? Why would a query parameter not be RESTful? It's just characters, right? Nobody cares about the characters in the URI. Yet everybody argues about them all the time. This happens all the time. People decide they want to build something in a RESTful fashion, so they spend all of their time arguing about where the slashes go. Now that's a good discussion. I like discussing pretty URIs, and I really, really like pretty URIs, but it's got nothing to do with REST. Because if you look at it from a REST perspective, there is no such thing as a RESTful URI. All the separation into different parts that you can look at, it's all true, but from a REST perspective, this is just one big single thing. You shouldn't be worrying about the characters in the URI. Because what you should care about is not that, it's not the letters, it's not the characters, you should be caring about the context in which they appear, right? You have something returned to you from the server. There's some context, that's what you should be parsing or reacting to. That's actually what your browser does, right? At least most of the time. Your browser, unless it's Google's browser talking to Google, but that's not something we want to imitate, right? People should not be looking at the URI, should not be looking at the characters, because then I can change this to something like that and it'll still work, right? That's a hypermedia context. It's the first litmus test for your REST API, whether you depend on characters, on specific characters in your URIs for things to work. Right. Now, I'm not talking about a server. For a server, it's perfectly fine to decompose the URI to somehow dispatch this to code. How else would it work? I'm specifically talking about clients. If you ever find yourself within your client connecting things, using string concatenation, something is really, really wrong, because you have not applied a hypermedia aspect to the whole thing. Make any sense? Okay, so next time somebody asks you, is this URI RESTful? Just be smug and tell them you're stupid. Don't do that. It's a risky thing, so you should be really careful. Okay, so the next one that I see is this one. Now this, a set of URI patterns with get, put, post, delete, and the effects that it has. I have to admit I advocated something like that for a long, long time as the perfect way to do REST. I like to give myself the benefit of doubt. I talked about the hypermedia thing too, right? I did that. But I didn't talk about it as strongly as I do today. Actually, these guys, Ian and Jim and Savas, did it a lot more strongly in their book because they made hypermedia a very, very important thing from the very beginning. Always claimed there's no such thing as a RESTful API without hypermedia. Now, this is much, much better than what people did 5 years ago. Because 5 years ago, you could shut down a server using a GET. Hopefully everybody these days understands why that's not a good idea, right? Because the Google crawler assumes that they can do a GET, because that's not supposed to do anything destructive. And if you shut down a server when somebody issues a GET, then it's your fault, not theirs, right? So there's a lot of positive things going on here. People actually build things, and that's better, but it's still not what you could actually label RESTful. These things look like this. Who here has an API that looks somewhat like this? So my guess is most of you, right? In fact, most of the people who actually expose an API on the web have something like that. Even the big companies do something like this. Why? What's wrong with this? What would you imagine is wrong with this thing? Anything?
Version numbers.
Version numbers. Okay, I agree. Anything else? Discoverability. Why? Lack of discoverability. Okay, that's a good point. Anything else you see? This thing? Who thinks there's nothing wrong with this? Admit it. It's fine. I'm not insulting. I'll try not to insult you. Later, I'll do the insulting later on the later slide. So the major problem in my view is we make the URIs the API. Right? The URIs are now what people will code against, right? There's a description. It says this is what the URI looks like. This is what their code is going to look like. It's going to plug those things together. It's going to follow those templates, and maybe they'll put those templates, those URI templates, you know, with the curly braces, into their code somewhere. But maybe they won't. Maybe they'll just use it as a, you know, as a way to tell them how to construct their string concatenation code. Right? That's what this is going to do. It's separate from the actual implementation because it's a separate document. This may be in a, well, if you work in an enterprise, this is in a docx file, right? In a Word file that you can download from SharePoint. If you're on the web, it's a PDF, right? If you're really on the web, it's an HTML file, which is a great thing. If you really do REST, it's part of your app. Right? So this documented URI thing is the first thing. The next one is immediately related to that, which is there are assumptions that now become a fact. So for example, what do I have in this example? I have customers and orders, right? So the orders are a sub-resource under the customer, which is from a pretty URI design standpoint, maybe the right thing to do, because the slash implies hierarchy. Am I talking about anything RESTful here? No, I'm not, just pretty URIs, right? So maybe there's some hierarchy you want to express, so that's why you put the orders under the customer. But maybe a year from now, you want to put the orders into a separate system. Now, everybody will assume that they can take the customer URI and append /orders to get to the orders, which is bad. That is not what should be happening. What should be happening is that in some response from the server, there's a link to the orders that you follow to do that, right? So you make it way more dynamic. And of course, Josh is right, because there are version numbers in URIs, and version numbers in URIs just suck. Right? Everybody does it, which doesn't make it any less sucky. It's just a stupid idea. Don't do that. Anybody want to talk about versioning?
There is versioning in there. It's actually just the API.
You're right. It's exactly the point. The version number is in the URI because the URI is the API. Right? That's part of it. So if I change the API, obviously the rules for constructing the URIs change, right? Now, what's the alternative? What could we do? So let's address this just very briefly, because otherwise somebody will ask the first thing. So when we talk about versioning, the first question we have to ask is, what is it that we're talking about? What are we versioning here? Are we versioning the actual data? You know, is it maybe this version of the customer? You know, this is the version before George edited the customer record, and this is the one after he edited it. That's a version of the data that we're talking about. Maybe it's a Confluence document, or the version of a file, or whatever, right? If you do that, then that's perfectly fine. It's actually the one case where I don't even object to having a version number in the URI, because that is then just part of the pretty URI thing again. Maybe if you want to express, I don't care. Just do that if you want. If it makes you happy, just do it. But that's the only occasion where you should be putting a version number in the URI, because it identifies the data that this URI points to, right? If you make every version number a separate thing with its own URI, then maybe you want to relate them somehow so that people can see that immediately. The same is true logically by deduction for documentation, because documentation is just data as well, right? That's one of the nice things in a RESTful scenario. Everything that you can express as a resource is now part of the same set of concepts. So every documentation page that you have can be its own resource that you can link to from the other pieces and back and forth, as you know. Formats, if you want to, although I'm not a fan, version your formats. I don't think versioning your formats means much, but if you're happy to do that, then just call your media types, if you dare to invent your own, give them a version number suffix or something. Again, I think that if text/HTML got by for 20 years, then you can probably too. But if you for some reason don't want to do that, then just put a version number in there. The one thing where I really have a problem is an API, because I don't even know what that is. If I'm a big company that offers lots of stuff to my clients, what's the What's the boundary of my API? Is it everything I do? Is it the Google API? How often is the Google API going to change its version, right? If they introduce a new service, is it a compatible change or something? No, it's not. It isn't changing anything. Specifically, it's not changing the identity of anything. How stupid would that be if it did, right? Identity is supposed the most long-living thing that you have there, right? So it should be stable over years. Cool URIs don't change and all that, right? That was written 15 years ago. So those things should be stable. Putting a version number in the URI means you have to change the URIs all the time with no reason at all. It's not a good idea, right? So what I recommend is actually use different media types, not for versioning, use them for different things. Kind of obvious, right? Use the version number in the URI if you want to version the thing itself, right? You know that particular document, I'm fine with that. Build new resources if you have new aspects. It's kind of a standard versioning strategy, right? You have to have some new thing that you want to say about this stuff. So, well, build that new thing and link it to the other one. That's what the web is really great at, right? New things that are connected to existing things. Which means, of course, that you have to reserve space for links, right? So you have to be able to, within that existing representation, have some place where you can put links to additional stuff, right? And that has to be designed into your formats from the very beginning. That's a very important thing. And to keep people happy, because some architect is going to tell you you have to have versions, version your docs. Works amazingly well, right? Just make a document that says this is the documentation of our API and give it version 2.1. That's cool. Now everybody has a version, which is just the version of that document, and you can apply any versioning logic that you like. It doesn't have anything to do, it does not belong at all into your actual exchanges. It doesn't have anything to do with your identities. It doesn't have anything to do with your formats. It's just a document that you version, right? So yeah, I'm actually telling you should not be versioning, and I'm really happy that Josh said the same thing this morning. So apparently some people can do that, and I'm kind of happy with it. Right. Any questions regarding that? Any disagreements here? Come on, people, you have to disagree. Somebody has to do that. Yes, please.
I'm not disagreeing, but I'm implementing a spec where they put the version number in the HTTP header.
So you were saying there is a spec that puts a version number into the HTTP header?
Yeah.
I'm not aware of.
Custom header with
Well, of course you can invent custom headers as much as you like with the same pros and cons that apply if you invent your own HTTP verbs, right? You can do that. You attach semantics to something that is not standardized. Now that actually may be fine. It sort of ties back to the self-descriptiveness constraint, right? So maybe self-descriptive for you means it's well-defined within your company or well-defined within your organization and the peers that interact with it. That's fine. It's like a local standard that you have established. If everybody does that, then that's fine. You won't find any standard infrastructure that will do anything meaningful with that. You are at risk that somebody will drop that header, for example, because some proxy will filter out all the headers it doesn't know. So there are some risks, but maybe you derive benefit from it. What I object to is that you actually have to do that, because what I think is is a general rule, right? So this is actually this particular thing here, right? Do you know this one, Postel's law? It's a kind of the robustness principle, things that make stuff simple, right? Which essentially means we all should be nice to each other. So if everybody does that, right? If everybody is liberal when they accept something and rigid when they send something, then if you connect stuff, blah, 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 you'll build up with a more resilient network of things, right? That's kind of the idea. Every time you are very, very strict about the stuff that you accept on the incoming side, you introduce a potential breakage that shouldn't be there, because you're really just being an ass, right? You're just looking at that and saying, well, sure, I could do it, but I won't. It doesn't follow the spec. I refuse to process this, sir. It doesn't sound, that doesn't sound like something that you actually want to do in a system that's supposed to work, as opposed to one that's supposed to satisfy some architectural rule. So, but that's just my view of things, right? So there's some rules that actually say what you should and shouldn't be doing to enable this, right? To enable this kind of communication. You kind of should actually say a receiving side on the left should support unknown links, ignore unknown content. That's a general principle, right? You don't fall apart if somebody sends you a field that you didn't expect. If you're not using it, so what? Just pass it along or ignore it. But don't just complain about it, right? Of course, you shouldn't be just breaking URI structures, although I have seen people do that as part of their build, right? Occasionally, they break all the URI structures on the server to see which clients fail, which is kind of a funny approach that you can only do in a scenario where you have power over your clients. Don't do that if you're a web API, and just, it's not a good way. Right? So back from versioning, right? If we have this idea about hypermedia, you remember this table that I had with these things, what's a possible step? And one thing that you can do if you have a REST API and want to make it more hypermedia aware is introduce something that I call a service document, which is a stolen term, right? So a service document is like a homepage, right? This is a homepage for my order management service. It has links to reasonable things that you might want to access from there. And of course, you could encode that in XML or another machine-readable format, and then essentially your client does the same thing that you as a user would do if you looked at that page, right? Here the client is no longer hard-coded against the URI, it's hard-coded against the value of this rel thing, right? So if you look, for example, at the canceled or the fulfilled link relation, then this one says, well, here, if you want to take a look at the orders that are already done, then you follow this link relation. If I change the URI to point to some archive system, nobody cares, right? Because it's just one level of indirection. It's not magic, it's not AI or anything, it's just a simple adding of one level of indirection, which might be exactly what you want to do if you have a device like this, right? That's a pain to update, right? It really sucks to have to update an application, one of these. Then you can actually do it this way, and this thing becomes magically aware of new stuff or new locations of things. That's you pay for it with this extra indirection, which you can alleviate a bit by caching, but you gain benefit because you now have this extra level, right? Pretty obvious. And of course, XML is totally uncool, so I put in the JSON variant as well. There are some standards covering this, right? There's something called JSON Home, which is a draft thing, but it's by Mark Nottingham, so it'll be a standard soon. And it's actually a somewhat standardized version of that. So that's the first step. A service document still is something that is a separate thing from your actual resource, right? It's somewhat metadata-like, but it's at least in your application, right? Because I get it from the application. The idea here being that my client needs a single URI. You give it one URI and that's it. From there on, it can just discover everything else, solving that discoverability problem. Right now, that's a lot better than having it in a Word or PDF document, because now you're putting that into the actual runtime. The server, when it starts up, will start serving the service document with the right links, maybe even the right capabilities. But obviously, you have resources in the first place, right? So if you have resources, why not add links to them from the very beginning, right? So if I do something, if I get an order, I can get back an order, and that order can have the links that point me to other things. It should have the links that point me to other interesting stuff, right? So the syntax really doesn't matter, right? I used something with an array here. That's a good thing if you're programming Java or have people who do that, and this one is a little bit better. If you have a more dynamic language, it doesn't really matter. The important point is that you have a place where you can put in links, and that you leave in the placeholder for where to put more of them, right? So that you can evolve this thing over the course of time and add more interesting stuff to it. So that's the second thing. The first one is a separate document. The second one is we add it to the resources. The third one is to actually use it for its original purpose, which is to drive the interaction, to give the clients opportunities to choose from, right? So if I have some sort of state machine, some flow that's encoded in my server, right? Certain things in the life cycle, in this case of an order, that tell it when to move from which state to which next state, then you can express those possible transitions in the hypermedia response. So when the server returns an answer to the client, that answer will include only the links that make sense. And the client can then only do that because it can only follow those things. Make any sense? Right? So we sort of control the flow of a client by means of the responses that we return from the server. Again, it's just like a browser-based HTML app, which is no coincidence because that's just the web, right? This whole REST thing is not a services thing, it's the architecture of the web. So again, does this make the client super smart? Is it now intelligent? Is it now a human? Of course not. That's not the goal, right? Nobody in this REST space Not in the REST space, maybe in the SemWeb space, but nobody in the REST space actually believes in systems that become magically intelligent. This just means you're not depending on a specific URI, you're depending on something that redirects you to that URI, right? That's the only, and that gives you certain flexibility here. Now that's a nice thing, but it's still not the complete misconception, because many people do that, right? But they still think this, right? Hypermedia is responses with links, right? So that's all that I talked about. It all makes sense. I don't regret any of it, but it's not the whole story, right? Because links is just one part of Hypermedia. Links are really a cool thing. It's a very cool thing. And if you have a REST API that uses links to control the client, to make the client more dynamic, then you've built something pretty neat. But you can go further than that. The next thing you can do is you can actually take a look at more interesting Hypermedia controls. So the first rule that we talked about is you don't want to have clients build URIs using string concatenation, right? That's why we moved from the descriptive API in that HTML document to something that's contained in the responses that you return from the server, right? But the problem is you cannot always enumerate all the possible URIs. How would you do that if it can be one of 20 million customers? How are you going to return a list of that? Doesn't make any sense, right? So you have to somehow give the client a way to come up with the next request, with including the URI, you know, all the stuff that they need to have for the next request, with some sort of recipe, right? Which is perfectly fine as well. So you can provide a recipe to the client. It's also Hypermedia. Actually, you're doing that all the time with this example, right? This is somewhat similar to what the Google homepage looks like. Right? It has a bit more stuff in it. But essentially, it's what it used to look like, what it should look like, but it doesn't. Right? It has just a search box. And that search box allows you to enter a query. And from a REST perspective, you can view this as a URI construction form. Right? You return this from the server to the client, and now the client will enter a query, and when they hit submit, because it's a GET form, a new URI will be built. It actually, the way how it's built is actually in the HTML spec, not the URI spec or the HTTP spec. The HTML spec tells you how a form is turned into a URI when you have a GET form. So what's built is a new query, and that query has what they use here, query equals something with the text that you've put into the search field. So you provide the client with a recipe for constructing any number of useful URIs. And you can do the same thing using a machine-readable format. It's not as if HTML weren't machine-readable, but people don't want to use that. So let's just use JSON here, and I have a URI template, which is by now also a standard. And that actually tells you is the exact same thing, right? It gives you a URI that looks like hard coding, but you're not hard coding the characters in the URI. You are just saying that you expect to find a query parameter in there. Once you have that query parameter, you can put your query into that slot and then make a new URI, right? So that's what you actually depend on. And you can do even more than that, which is give the client a form that maybe contains some default data, right? This is like an HTML form that, which is not shown here, could have some hidden fields, right? It's a form. Actually, I'm telling the client how to build the next request, the next post request. Right? It's a Hypermedia control that in this particular case tells the client, well, if you want to post something to me, this is the format that I expect, with some values, with some type information, right? It's all dynamic, it's all at runtime. You have the information that this is a text field, and this is, with new HTML5 controls, this is an email field, and this is a date field, and then you can fill that in and send it to the server. Which essentially means that you can tell the client to send you a request that the client didn't know how to build when it was built, right? So you dynamically extend the client's capabilities of sending a request. You can do the same thing with JSON as well, right? You return something to the client. Format doesn't matter. You return something to the client, and the client then is able to use that to build the next request, which is a very, very powerful mechanism to build stuff like that. Okay? Any questions regarding that? So the question is, how much information can I send to the client, right? Can I let them know what exactly I expect here? Not in HTML, not right now. It's better. It's becoming better over time. And there are certain ways you can do that with your own more or less proprietary format. So you could have something like JSON and link that to a JSON schema. Use something like JSON LD. Lots of things that allow you to do some of that. None of them which allows you to do that in a perfect fashion, right? So.
Form includes the ENC type, which tells you exactly the format you expect.
Okay, so form includes the ENC type. Of course, you're limited depending on whether you expect this to work in the browser, which then means it's a fixed set, or whether you're willing to extend that to something else that you mean yourself. That's a good point. Yes, we have more ways to say how the actual information should be encoded when it's sent from the client to the server. Right. Anything else? So let me leave you with a final one, which is something that I think not many people, including myself, do. So most of the time when we think about REST, we're talking about services, this is wrong, but it's a different kind of discussion. Right? I'm not talking about the way we could build web UIs, unless you're willing to spend extra time sometime later. I'll talk to you for hours. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is even when we're talking about machine-to-machine interaction, we typically have this view of building a service interface. Right? We're building an interface to some capability. Right? And somehow that's not really what we should be doing. Right? We're obviously not doing that. That would be some point-to-point integration kind of thing. But we believe we're doing this. We believe we're building an API to a server that will be used by many clients. And we can do that in ways that are more or less RESTful. But what we really should be doing, if we really want to do things by the book and get the full seal of approval of the REST High Church or something, then we should be building hypermedia types that are independent of a particular server. Right? We shouldn't be building something like a Twitter API. We shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be building a Confluence or a Jira API. We should be building a tracker hypermedia format, because that tracker hypermedia format would enable me to connect any client that knows the hypermedia format to any server that supports that. Right? In fact, it would allow me to connect any client to any number of servers that support that simultaneously. Think about what your browser actually is. Your browser is a client that will talk to a lot of machines at the same time. Right? It's almost magic. It's almost as if you could have a client that could post your status to both Twitter and Facebook. Imagine how crazy innovative that would be. I mean, there are obviously reasons why neither Twitter or Facebook wants you to have that. But that doesn't mean that it's not technically the right thing. And maybe we should be building stuff that way. Maybe we should be designing our own fancy hypermedia formats. Except that's really a lot of work. It's really hard to do. So maybe we should just use some. Right? This is one of those things. Application plus Atom XML. That's actually a standardized format. There's a publishing protocol, there's a syndication format that you can use to build stuff. Or we could use something like OpenSearch. Or we could use one of those upcoming new fancy things like collection plus JSON or hell plus JSON. This frantic searching is really funny. Hell plus JSON or Siren plus JSON. Lots of existing formats that you could use to do that. Or, that's the final thought, you could just go with text and text HTML. I mean, that's a very, very widespread format. Why not use that for machine-to-machine communication, right? That would be a really nice aspect, because after all, if you look at this, why is this completely acceptable and this not? There's really no reason why one kind of XML-y thing is okay and the other one isn't. So, concluding with the benefits of using HTML as your hypermedia format, you get this ubiquity and well-known supported hypermedia controls, a pretty good standard client, lots of programming tools, and essentially, as Ian told me this noon, URIs is a nice side effect, right? Your API magically becomes usable from a browser if it just uses HTML as its format. But we all know that's crazy talk, because you would never do that, right? You would never use HTML. Just wait a year. It's sounding just as crazy as REST did 10 years ago, and maybe it's going to be the thing of the future. That's all I have right now as well. So the comment was, in none of my examples did I talk about how these links should be accessed, right? I did not say use a get here in the hypermedia format somewhere. You could use a get or a post. Except in the HTML example. In the HTML example, I actually had a form that either had a get or a post in it, right? So there are two ways you can do that. Either you hard-code it in your format's description. So if you invent a format, then it could be your choice, like HTML does with the IMG tag, to say I have a tag, it has src equals something, and you're only ever supposed to do a get, and that's what it says in the spec of your hypermedia format. Or you could make it explicit, like Atom does, or like HTML does with the form element, and just have a type or action or method attribute that tells the client to do that. The question is, how much does that actually give you? That's why I tend to not put it in, because I just assume the client to be not as smart to do that at runtime. I assume that the client is smart enough to have the URI determined at runtime. I don't think it has much benefit to provide that flexibility, but maybe I'm wrong. It just very much depends on your use case, and it would be perfectly fine to include that method as well. Yeah, Ian.
Because I actually see forms as a way of programming the client.
Forms are a way of programming the client. I will fully agree with that, yes. So it depends. The browser obviously is a very, very dynamic, very generic thing. The browser doesn't know that you're ordering a book. And if you're building a client at that level of generosity, is that a word? At that level of being generic, right, then it makes perfect sense to have more information in the hypermedia controls. The less generic, the more specific your client becomes, the fewer information items, the fewer aspects of that you need to specify in the hypermedia format. So there are many ways to specify the actions that you can do with a document. One of the most common things is to include the link relations and have those signify that to the client. So if I have a document that I can edit, then there's a link relation that allows me to edit it. That might actually be a good example for not having to specify whether it's a get or a put. So if I include a link rel equals edit, then in my documentation I would say whenever you find that link, you can do a get to become an edit form, or you can just put the new content. Then that would be the semantics of this particular type of link, and I could see that this is a semantic because the edit link relation would be documented that way. In fact, it is documented exactly that way, and you could just use that. Excellent question. Do I know any examples of widely used public APIs that fully follow this model? No. There are some things like there's a new Amazon API, I forgot for which purpose it was, that uses HAL and does some hypermedia aspects. There is the GitHub pull request API that does some of that. But most of those who do really major things don't have much hypermedia. I think Facebook has some, but I'm not a Facebook user, so I wouldn't know. Sorry? Tim Bray did a cloud API for Sun, right? But that's Sun, unfortunately, so we don't have much of that left. Again, but I'm sort of optimistic about the whole thing. If it has value, I believe it has, then it'll appear in more and more public APIs, unless they have a reason that's not technical, but rather walled garden-like to not enable that type of stuff. So thanks a lot for your attention. I'm around if you want to ask questions. Have fun at the conference.